Hello, everyone, once again to our sessions of the Climate Finance Academy. We're here today to talk about one of the most important topics for us in our working group, which is the climate finance goals in general. And we have a delightful list of speakers today that we are going to be introducing one by one. But first, want to thank you everyone for being here today and for being part of the Climate Finance Academy. It's been a while, a couple weeks, and we're very happy to be back again. So just to have a little bit of introduction on where we are, we're gonna invite Xavi Meado. I hope you pronounced your last name right. She is a manager at the Climate Policy Initiative London team, bringing expertise in tracking and evaluating global and national climate finance trends and climate policies, and leading the CPI's national tracking workstream. We're very happy to have you here as a speaker. You have been supporting our working group sessions in the past, and you have been involved in maybe let's say one of the most important climate finance reports out there. Happy if you can introduce whatever you want as well and share your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Gennaro. And I'm just quickly going to put my presentation up. Yeah. Give me a second. Let me know if all can see it properly. Gennaro, if you can let me know if it's in presentation mode.
We see it presentation mode.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gennaro, for the introduction. I'm Xavi Meetal, as Gennaro mentioned, from Climate Policy Initiative UK office and lead CPI's National Regional Tracking Initiatives. A lot of my work is currently focused in Africa, but I'm really happy to present the Global Landscape Report. For those of you not familiar with Climate Policy Initiative, we are basically an analysis and advisory organization that has deep expertise in finance and policy, and we work closely with governments and financial institutions, businesses, to drive economic growth while also addressing climate change issues, right? We now have 7 offices across the globe: Brazil, India, Indonesia, US, UK, and we recently opened the one in Cape Town. So we're excited about that one, given a lot of work has been done in Africa in the past. Today I'll be presenting the Global Climate Finance Landscape Study. So basically what that report does is, and this is the area that we've been working on, since 2010, since inception, and we have more than a decade of experience in tracking these climate finance, whether at regional level, national level, global level, and even sectoral level. So you see those weird Sankey diagrams that I'm going to show, and you probably recognize us from there. So what this report really does is it's tried to provide a more comprehensive information set of what actors are investing in climate finance, public, private, what instruments, what recipients, who are the recipients of those finance, what are the users and sectors. And we're looking at finance that's going to mitigation and adaptation. This year report basically tracks 2021, 2020 numbers. So whenever I say a number, it's probably an average, a binary average for those two, basically smoothen out any fluctuations that we have in yearly numbers. And these is the report that kind of informs the UNFCCC Biennial Assessment Report. I'm myself the author for the 2nd chapter and the 3rd chapter, half of it, IPCC, and a lot of other conversations and negotiations, and it all feeds into all of those. So I think how basically structured is like where we are right now, where we want to go. So basically trying to understand the gaps at sectoral level and other levels, and then also trying to see how we can get where we want to. So I think that will be partially the structure of the presentation. Let me start with the good news first before going gloomier and grimmer like the UK weather. Actually, it's not that bad today, so can't complain about that one. But yeah, let me start with the good news first. For the first time in the history, since we've been tracking climate finance, we did hit the 1 trillion mark, and actually more precisely $1.3 trillion, which basically means we nearly doubled, what we were able to track 4 years back. So if you see 2017, 2018 numbers versus 21-22 numbers. Some of this change is also due to the new data gap, the new data sources that we introduced, but largely it's a broad trend that we see, a steep trend in the last 1 or 2 years. And a quick clarification of what we are tracking and what we don't track. So when I say climate finance, we are only talking about new primary investments that are going to mitigation adaptation interventions. And when I say transactions, they just basically mean real economy change. So think about investments at project level, like building a renewable energy power plant or building a adaptive capacity of a local community, etc. What we don't track is secondary flows, which is basically think about like merger and acquisitions and other things, which is basically not resulting in a real economy transaction, but morely like mere exchange of hands. We do have a more detailed methodology document, a data source, etc. That's available. I can share the link and put that in the chat. But all this is basically a non-double counted number that we're trying to put up in the global landscape report. So apart from the good news, we do see that this is not sufficient. You see a huge gap in what's needed versus where the flows are. And if you see, we need at least 5.9 or 5.9 trillion dollars in annual investments by 2030. And just to say where these needs numbers are coming from, they're coming from a lot of publicly available data sources and different scenarios across different sectors like energy, agriculture, adaptation from very different organizations. So the point here being that it's not like need assessment is not an exact science, but real need would depend on the decisions that we're taking right now, the decarbonization trajectories of those different countries. And depending on the sector, the region, the needs are very heterogeneous. And I think one thing I say from Africa experience is like adaptation needs are not even properly estimated. So, and these are issues that all kind of feeds into and poses issues for the NCQG, right? When you're deciding what the goal should look like, we should really understand also in relation to what the needs look like, right? So yeah, I just want to highlight a bit like the issues around like estimating needs of countries. I would like to put this number, the 1.3 trillion that I talked about, just in context, because I think it's important to understand this one, because this 1.3 trillion is just 1% of the global GDP. So you see, there is a lot out there that can be kind of made a bit low carbon. When you compare with the public sector alone, the military expenditure that was done in 2022, it's almost twice as much. Implicit subsidies that we had in fossil fuel were almost 7 trillion. So that in relation to 7 trillions in these numbers, 1.3 trillion really seems like a small amount. And so the question is not really how to get more investments, climate investment, but also how to shift your existing financing investments away from carbon users, right? Achieving a more resilient and a just net zero world where all sort of these public and private actors need to align their finances with those international climate goals that agreed in the Paris Agreement and what will be agreed in the future as well. The next slide basically shows the cost of inaction. And what do I mean by that? It basically means like any delayed action that we're doing right now, any failure to act and not be on the 1.5 trajectory will result in significantly higher cost down the lane. And various studies are there, that really shows that if you're looking at under the current policies that our governments are kind of going with, warming will exceed like 3 degrees, right? And leading to sort of macroeconomic loss of something in the range of 18% GDP by 2050, and much more when we go in 2100. And what you see here is that 1266 figure here that you see on the graph here, that really tells you what the considerable social and economic losses would be compared to even if you're continuing as a business as usual scenario. And again, these are gross underestimations. I would say dramatic underestimations, because they fail to take into account, different biodiversity losses or stranded losses and social issues, or maybe like inadequately do so. So there's the cost can be much higher, and really outstrip the cost or the financing that needed to address climate change right now. Yeah, so this is the famous Sankey diagram that we have. And what it tells is really a snapshot of life cycle of climate finance flows that you have. So the blue part is say the sources and intermediaries, public ones, which are providing different climate finance. So you see governments, you see DFRs, whether they're multilateral, national, and bilateral ones. You have multilateral climate funds and other actors. Similarly, on the orange side, you have the different private actors, which are further broken down by different categories like commercial financial institutions, corporations, etc., and households. Actually, those were the key ones. And then it shows like where, and I'm going to break the diagram to you in like subsequent graphics, but just to let you know, this is how the life cycle looks like, and then what the instruments it's kind of they're using to render those climate finance. So we're talking about grants, you're talking about debt, you're talking about equity, and all those sort of different instruments. What uses it's going into? So adaptation, mitigation, and by dual benefits, we basically mean any project that's rendering both adaptation mitigation benefits. And then you go further down, you see the sectoral where it's spent, like renewable energy, transport, agriculture. I think one of the key finding is that you see almost the equal split between public and private actors. Development financial institutions kind of contribute to almost 57% of total public finance, and probably adding up to something around $240 billion. And they are also almost 30% of the climate finance flows. And that's followed by state-owned enterprise and government expenditure, etc. And for private actors, it's again commercial financial institutions, corporations, and households. They are the largest investors, and they are the real actors that are kind of engaging in real economic activities. Say, for instance, installation of like buying of EVs or solar water heater installations and other aspects, technologies and different technologies. This graph tells you like how mitigation continues to attract almost all of climate finance, receiving almost more than 90% of the total climate finance, and leaving far behind adaptation dual benefit projects. And when I say mitigation, a lot of it's centered into energy and transport sector alone, which almost accounting for 2/3 of annual climate finance flows. And mitigation also seems to be attracting virtually all the climate finance coming from private sector. I mean, we probably expect that, right? We're a bit more commercially viable technologies, and to lesser extent, dual benefits or other things, adaptation ones, because they probably remains more prerogative of public actors. There are more details on sectoral breakdowns in the reports. I highly recommend, if you're so interested in it, please go ahead and read it. But due to paucity of time, I keep it limited to just key messages. This graph again kind of shows the investment gap. Mitigation, even though it's attracting 90%, the investment gap to avoid the worst impacts of climate change remains really huge. And this chart compares mitigation flows in green. Those are the greens, and the mitigation needs are in yellow. So you see this big, huge yellow bars, right? And they are the needs. And on a secondary axis, we also kind of plotted the mitigation potential. So while we see that mitigation almost received like 1.2 trillion out of the 1.3 trillion, but you actually need to go 7 times higher to kind of reach the required needs. And if you look at the breakdown by sectors, you observe like transport and energy sector receiving a lot, but I think it's important to also see the underfunding in the AFLU sector, which is the last two bars. Given that the sector is estimated to have the largest mitigation potential, but it's still receiving minimal finance in mitigation. Solutions such as like sustainable crops or livestock production, afforestation, reforestation, all those things do play a crucial role, but they're not getting the finance that's needed. This graph is interesting because it gives you a split of instruments by different use types, adaptation, dual benefits, and mitigation. What we see is that mitigation flows are dispersed through a broad range of instruments compared to adaptation and dual benefits. And just largely due to the, sort of these wider variety of investors involved, both from public and private actors, which all have probably different risk and return profiles and mandates. And from the graph, you can see also that, 60%, so basically, 60% of the mitigation finance is actually, coming in the form of debt. while a lot of adaptation finance is coming from, bit of grants, I would say. So if you see the purple, like it's project level debt from adaptation 59%, but also, there are grants that is also accounting for a good chunk of adaptation financing. Equity financing and, so basically these are balance sheet financing. These terminologies are there in the methodologies. I would like you to go through them if you wish. But that account for almost 35% of total and was provided for mostly by private actors, investors, and especially, again, going into renewable energy efficient buildings and sustainable transport solutions. Concessional finance. So basically what we mean by concessional is low cost debt, which is in the light purple area, and the grants in blue that account for almost less than 10%. And not surprisingly, this share is much lower for mitigation than adaptation dual benefits because, again, where returns are generally not as high and the landscape is basically made of public investors. And, it's sort of really important also, like in these key sectors to know the concessional finance plays a key role in unlocking further capital, and it's sort of crucial for managing, different risks and uncertainties that are related to those emerging technologies and markets, especially a lot on the adaptation side. Adaptation, grew really modestly, almost accounting for just 5% of total global finance. So you see this huge adaptation gap. And that's something that we talk about, how to mobilize finance for adaptation. It was largely, as I mentioned as well, kind of even channeled through debt and heavily distributed between water and waste sector. So you do see a bit of changes in which sector gets financed under adaptation versus probably mitigation, and which makes sense if it's going to water sector because increasing global water stress and so-called other cross-sectoral solutions. So when I say other cross-sectoral solutions, it'll be like investments in early warning systems and policy and capacity building. So a lot of finance is going into it, which is great. And adaptation finance remains kind of dominated by public actors. So there's hardly any private sector finance that you see, but also this could be, and probably that's nice to see that there's a genuine drive from DFIs and public institutions to avoid these adverse impacts of climate change, and kind of going more finance. But I think the kind of quantum of finance that we need from on adaptation, I think it's a lot has to come also from private sector. So there's real need to demonstrate a real business case for adaptation investments. Yeah, again, I think I'm probably badgering a bit more this point that the needs are so high, like approximately 3.5, 4 times of adaptation needs are not met. And again, this is a broad underestimation of adaptation needs. I mean, I do work on like looking at the NDCs and the latest submissions. Even then, like for African countries, they can say so. I've had a look at all the NDCs, and then you hardly see like being able to track adequately the adaptation finance. That remains an area. Like there's some aggregated figures that are given for certain NDCs, but without a breakdown of what sector is going to, etc. So so even those needs are sort of just underestimated. I think one thing here, a point to kind of take note of is that when you sort of differentiate between funding that's sourced and committed domestically within countries and what's sourced and committed internationally, you see a bit of difference, right? So while you see domestic adaptation finances mostly for countries in East Asia and Pacific, basically a lot of it is China. However, you filter by international funding, then you see like Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the largest recipients of adaptation finance, so reaching somewhere $10.8 billion. So I think it's important to also kind of slice and dice the data to see more nuanced perspective on adaptation as well. Turning back to a bit of global picture, and these are like this basically shows where the finance is going to, or whether domestically or international ones, and you see the triple digit numbers are basically Western Europe, East Asia, and US and Canada. And of course, you see the split by public and private as well, which varies substantially by region, and tells you like the relative dominance of private capital in these regions. It's important to also know that substantially majority of track finance was raised and spent domestically. So, domestic resource mobilization, enabling policies become super important. And again, given the quantum, it can't be met publicly or internationally. This year, what we did also in the landscape was to kind of differentiate between developed, emerging markets and developing economies, and also, least developed countries. So we do have a bit of like striking numbers. So for instance, only 2% of the global climate finance flow to or within the LDCs, while 14% flew to emerging market developing economies, and those exclude China, because if you take China, then it's a very different picture. So yeah, you do see this imbalance between climate change vulnerability and the destination of climate finance, with some of the most vulnerable countries receiving disproportionately really low minimal finance. And when you do sort of these regional assessments, say for Africa or other landscapes, then you see these becomes a bit more stark as well. Now quickly moving on to the recommendations. I mean, there are a lot more we can say, like how to solve this climate finance issue, but we have identified a few key ones, so that we can have this paradigm shift in finance. And this links really well with different ongoing negotiations, or G20 COP negotiations. They'll be discussed in New York Climate Week and CQGs, etc. So they all sort of hopefully inform those, and they feed into those different events. One is, I think we know, like the institutional, the international financial institutions, infrastructure, the financial system, for both public and private actors needs to transform. They are sort of this uniquely positioned, to take on more risk, channel innovative finance, and leverage concessional finance to sort of expand also private flows in the process. And we want to make sure that our financial institutions are sort of sustainable and fit for purpose to address these different multiple crises. Whether you talk about debt or any other economic crisis, and be able to do finance global public goods like adaptation and dual benefits. We do have some more concrete recommendations around it. Like there's there are reports out there, like but just to highlight, there's talks about creating country sector climate finance disbursement platforms that fund programs based on countries' development priorities and needs. Also, there's really stressing on like how financial institutions can support mobilize domestic finance to strengthen and deepen the local capital markets. I think that's another important one, whether through investment in technical assistance or capacity building. I think that becomes really important. And also, I think, of course, there's talks about balance sheet optimization of MDBs, and revising the eligibility criteria for concessional finance, and improving cross-country risk diversification, data sharing. You probably heard about the GEMS data that kind of made open, and where we're trying to see what the recovery rate or the exposure looks like, that can help inform decision making by private actors as well. So I think there's all these talks about how we can kind of change that financial institution transformation. Also from the private sector, there's need to strengthen net zero integrity. That becomes really crucial. We did see a proliferation of net zero commitments. However, they probably yet to clearly translate into any meaningful changes in private capital, etc., and move away from harmful activities. There's also bridging climate development needs. I think we all know it, like any of the development climate action makes sense because it brings along with multiple co-benefits, whether to nature or public health or energy systems, access, all those, gender equality, all those aspects. I think here I would say it becomes really important for us to like do a cost of inaction analysis, like quantifying actual losses, economic losses of climate disaster of the previous years, estimating what the future potential losses could look like, so that it becomes easy to make that decision to do an investment, whether it's in budget or fiscal or, financial management measures, etc. And those could really drive conversation on, importance of mobilizing resources to counteract environmental impact and the role of international forums mobilizing those finance. Um, Another point I think I want to mention here is about how we want to integrate and mainstream adaptation activities across financial systems. And there, of course, need for more innovative financing instruments like blended finance and green bonds and insurance. There's also need for more technical um, and knowledge-based support as well, like bringing about those government reforms, etc., to enhance accessibility and effectiveness of the adaptation finance. And yeah, I think another thing about the just transition aspect, or even like just the transition aspect, fossil fuels are sort of these deeply embedded in economies and communities, right? And pathways for ending any fossil fuel extraction and consumption must account for the impacts they have on the key stakeholders, right? Whether from national to local, you're talking about workers and communities and public and private employers, government. The impact is on fiscal capacity and economic implication of it. So I think all these needs to be taken into account. Um, Third point is also about like mobilizing domestic capital. As I mentioned, the needs are so high, like they cannot be met internationally or publicly alone. And given the tight balance sheets the governments are facing in different countries, it becomes more and more difficult, right? Um, I think here a point important to mention is the NDC submissions, right? They are the BTRs, etc., are due in February, and we see the current NDCs are still significantly misaligned with Paris Agreement goals. And could lead to temperature way above 1.5. So I think injecting that momentum into the next generation of climate transition and resilient plans would be sort of key. And I think I talked about the local ecosystem and enabling factors like policy frameworks, etc., that could really kind of direct the private sector in the right direction. They understand the right signaling is there. You need sort of need assessment, as I mentioned, right? The needs are hardly assessed, creating the readiness assessment roadmaps, what the investment pathway would look like. I think that becomes really important coming from and right signaling from the government side. And also, I think institutional investors, sovereign wealth fund, I think there's hardly data that we are able to track. So that's also one thing, right? Like there's not enough data reporting, but also I think there's not enough investments coming from those actors as well. So I think bringing those in the picture, I think that would be really key. That private sector, domestic private sector, if I can say so. And they are facing these different, like whether you talk about Africa or other countries, they are sharing risks such as like credit risk or currency risk, off-taker risk. There's so many risks, political liquidity. So I think it's mobilizing, addressing those by MDBs or IFIs, through guarantees or different blended finance instruments. I think those becomes really important to kind of mobilize finance. Last but not the least, I think it's of course acting to improve data. I think that's something we really need high quality climate finance data, trying to understand these investment gaps, even at like not just a global level, I think at country level, just trying to understand what sectors are not receiving finance by, to ensure that, you're building those effective solutions or, informing investors and, making that collective progress. I think that becomes really important. So to kind of cut away with this information asymmetry and ensuring, people have the right data to kind of make the right decisions as well. I mean, even now until now, we don't really have an official definition of climate. I mean, UNFCCC definition does come closely to the official one, but there's so much. It's not standardized. There are like different definitions, and frankly, nobody has any obligation to report on climate finance. We don't have domestic budget tagging in place for most of the countries, which is not really ideal to not to be able to make those decisions right. So I know I spoke a lot, but I'll stop here. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion we're going to be having today, and happy to answer any questions you have right now or as we progress. I don't know, Junaro, what's the plan?
All right. Hi, Chavi. Thank you so much for this session. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. So right about now, we're going to be taking questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hands. Then we'll take it from there. All right, Tandon, you can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Hi, Zoe, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Hi, Chavi. Thank you so much for this great session. I had a few questions for you, but maybe I'll just restrict myself to just two questions so that others also get a chance to ask. So my question is that I understand that there are different funds being set up in the name of climate finance, right? And one of these funds is GCF funds, and there are many other funds that have been come up in this entire process. And also, like there have been talks in the market to also explore innovative financing mechanisms like blended finance, like you mentioned before. But we also see this challenge that many of the like developing countries or least developing countries, they don't have the capacity to be able to sort of utilize those funds, and then you need to sort of first go and set up the institutional, like create institutional capacity so that they know they have the knowledge as well as people to be able to sort of utilize those funds. So, how do you see that different countries are doing, especially on this aspect? And my second question to you is like you mentioned the gap between adaptation and mitigation finance, right? So I wanted to understand like how like why is this gap and how can we close this gap? And sorry, just one last question to you is I also wanted to like understand from you how you also like mentioned one of the aspects of need assessments. How is this needs assessment takes place and how each country does it, or is there a format where needs assessment is being done and then we come up to know that okay, this is the gap, and how much financing each country needs? Thank you. Sorry, I was super long.
Cool. Are there any more questions as well, or I should take?
I
Just
see
answer
there's
hers
one more
first.
question.
Okay.
Yeah, you can answer.
Answer tandems first, then we'll take the next person.
Cool. So point well taken on like, yeah, MCFs, there have been, I mean, there's general consensus have been slow in like kind of rendering the funds, and, the access to finance is real big issue. And as I mentioned, LDC probably only accounts for like 2% of global climate finance flows, right? And that also comes in the wake of like, these different challenges that different countries are facing, high debt vulnerability, sometimes even credit rating degrades, and kind of where do they get the finance from. I think for in that context about multilateral climate funds, I mean there has been progress, and I can talk about Africa a bit because I've seen the numbers there. So a lot of this is based, the financing that comes from MCF to LDCs in other countries, to LDC countries, is in the form of the grant. So that's like a good example, and where they will, what different sectors they're going into as well, like water sector, and they're going to a diverse sector. So I think that I won't say impact because we don't do impact assessments, but it's going in the right direction. That's what we can say. But there's still a lot more needs to be done. They're like accredited agencies are not there in every African countries, or countries that probably need it. So access is definitely an issue when you talk about these multilateral climate funds. But that being said, I think here a role of like I think national development banks also, which are most of the accredited agency, becomes really important and probably a bit underplayed as well, because that's where the significant potential to kind of accelerate those global climate finance investment needs can really happen, because they're sitting rightly in the position, right? They're uniquely positioned. They have access to the local markets, they understand the nitty-gritties of it, and they also understand the institutional mandates, etc. They can work. So I would say that, yeah, I think the role of MDBs and their connections, and bringing those institutional capacities and learning, I think that would really kind of enhance or mobilize a bit more a better access to climate finance. I also see, I think in kind of institutional climate mainstreaming, I think that's probably even NDBs are going to be doing. So it's also a trickle down effect, right? What they can teach at the local level and what they can learn from MDBs. So I think that role and connection of NDBs and national development banks really becomes very important when kind of working through these MCFs. And you talked about sorry, I just missed the question. The next question was also on how we can close the gap between mitigation and adaptation, right? Yeah, I think, yeah, adaptation, as I mentioned, I think it's also there are a lot of these examples out there in adaptation that needs to be demonstrated well, because right now it's just basically taking this out, understanding out like, oh, it's a public good, and there's no commercial viability. There are examples where we can kind of demonstrate that pipeline of investable or commercially viable projects, even in adaptation space. I think that showcasing that investable pipeline becomes really important. I would say that's one thing for adaptation that could really work. But also, I do believe that right now it's going to be a lot of it's going to be grant based or low project cost based financing that will go in adaptation before it becomes fully scalable in a lot many ways. So it's sort of adaptation is also a different animal altogether, right? We're talking about mitigation, which is, yeah, it's we understood the technologies, I understood well the renewable energy or other ones in transport sector now. Like transport sector is what renewable energy was 10 years back. So we now understand those things better. Now we thinking about waste and water sector and other things. So I think it will take a bit of time to get adaptation in private sector purview, but I think the private sector's investment would become really, really important if we want to scale. If we basically need the finance that's needed to kind of fill that gap that we see. And of course, I mean, there are lots of these different blended instruments. CPR themselves work on a lot of these lab instruments that are shown to have commercial viability. We try to scale those up and try to ensure that these ideas are pilot ready and kind of get commercial financing. And they have done in the past. So I think there's need to showcase those cases a lot more better.
Thank you.
And
so
you
much.
also talked about, sorry, and you also talked about the needs assessment, right? Yeah, that's really an area that we are also following in trying to understand how different NDCs are costed by different technologies, by different sectors. As I said, like in Africa, I mean, we did sort of these needs assessment and gaps, and we realized that, yeah, like hardly any country are reporting adaptation financing. There are some really good cases, like say, for instance, South Africa. I would say Togo, Rwanda, like there was a couple of NDCs where you probably don't expect to have such detailed, thorough list of project investment cost and, trying to understand different scenarios and how mitigation scenarios are going to affect your adaptation costing as well. So there are these amazing cases of, NDCs going in a lot more detail and doing those needs assessment. But again, that being said, there are like different estimates available from different ones. So for instance, we did like a bottom-up analysis. So there are two ways of doing it, right? Either you do a bottom-up analysis where you're looking at countries, NDCs, what they're reporting, what different projects they're doing. And then there's a top-down estimate where you see the alignment with the different scenarios and what you need investment, what sort of investment you need to align those investments around. So there are like two different scenarios, two different approaches you can kind of do need estimations on. And they leave like very varied results. Like think about like something between 200 billion per year to something 450 billion per year range, when you do a top down versus a bottom up approach. So it is a very gray area right now. There's no unified approaches or assessments that we can do, and every country is doing their own thing. Some countries are reporting project level information, some countries are using some different scenarios, etc. So yeah, it needs to be a bit more coherent to get everybody on the same plane and kind of feed into the NCQGs and etc.
All right, thank you so much, Chavi, for the answer. We're going to be taking Brigu's and Christian's question now. Please be as concise as possible so she can take other questions in the chat box. All right, Brigu, go ahead.
Yes, hi, Chavi. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. I was just wondering, in one of your slides, you showed that there's a lot of flows towards around 565 billion, if I'm not wrong, from Southeast Asia towards climate finance. Is it because they're at a lot of geographical risk or something, or and yeah, that was like a nuance. And the second question I have is, I'm here in India and I'm talking. I have talked to some companies, a few companies regarding the climate finance and transition planning. But the problem here we face is the problem like this is the fourth industrial revolution for them, and for them it's like strengthening their balance sheets. They don't care about carbon credits and transitioning for now. So the thing is how and I've also worked in Western Europe. I know how it is. There's a different culture, but how to, I know there's articles, a lot of things going on, but still it's really difficult to, pitch those things to especially clients in India, for example, who really don't find value in this. Like how to, is there any way to, make that perceived value for them to, get enhanced and, really help them push to tell them it's better to begin now than later?
All right, Christian, can you take your question as well so she can answer them together?
Absolutely. My question is a little bit similar to that, just actually approaching it from a little bit different perspective. So I'm working on the topic of how we can transition institutional and traditional venture capital towards impact. And while sure, we're not talking about $5 trillion, the whole VC sector is around 600 billion. But I still believe that it can be a very crucial part in developing and accelerating some of those solutions that we need to implement to deal with the crisis. So my question to you, in short, is what role does it play when we're talking about the fully private markets? So not private governmental market, but actually like finding private business models that support the adoption. And if you have any suggestions of where we should look on further for driving this topic.
Yeah, no, you guys are right. Like private finance is key to it's the missing puzzle, right? Whether it's adaptation or even in generally in mitigation. But also I think private financial institutions currently sort of possess this very asymmetrical understanding of both the physical and transitionary risk posed by climate change, right? And how they affect their portfolios. So if you talk about primary materiality, you're gonna, I think it's just, I think I mentioned about cost of inaction, right? Like, I think that needs to be brought on a bit more, whether it's in the perspective of like primary materiality, so any event, floods, etc. They're gonna damage assets, or kind of increase your risk of default. So I think financial institutions need to take into account those risks a bit more properly to assess credit risk and adjust different loan conditions or whatever. So those are like physical risk, which has a direct impact on private sector. Also transitionary risk, right? You're talking about stranded assets and reduced profitabilities in carbon intensive sectors, and it would require private sector to manage those exposures, etc. When they're going to face with a new regulation, or when the market shifts. So there's these actions that are needed, right? And then you also talk about secondary materiality, right? Like when you talk about indirect impacts in communities, etc. So for instance, insurance sector would increase insurance claims, or sort of these harm to even financial institution reputations, if they finance these unsustainable activities. Nowadays, you see everybody is being called upon, right? So there are these different risks. And, if you look at the material impact, I think any of the private sector, when they're doing the assessments, they need to take all those things into account, right? And that's when I think probably action can be a bit more, that's what will probably get them into action. So I think bringing that cost of inaction bit, the impact assessment, ensuring they're mainstreaming these different credit risk or transitory risk and physical risk in their portfolios, I think that's when it becomes really evident and probably make them act a bit more than what probably than business as usual that they're doing. So yeah, I understand it's like very difficult, Rigu, and you're right. It becomes very difficult when you go to have these
conversations. The problem here is they just want to see cash flows. They just see cash flow statements. They don't see.
So, and that's very myopic view, right? So I think understanding those risks they will have on their balance sheets, if not now, probably 1 year, or even now, right? Like these are real risks. Like if you're just financing.
I want to disagree a little bit that we are actually seeing it. At least our research is actually pointing out that at least in Scandinavia, investors are now traditional investors, not impact-driven investors, want you to have in your pitch impact, and if you don't, you might not get the investment, because the problem you're solving needs to be greater than just something here and now. And therefore, if you're solving challenges related to climate, it actually proves a lot extra value. And we are now trying to understand why are our investors here aware of this and see it as a positive. And then when we invest interview investors from other regions to it's added risk and it actually just costs more and it's not going to generate as much money. So let's talk about this more. And thank you so much, Xavi, for answering the questions. And yeah, look forward to staying in touch.
Great.
All right, thank you so much, Xavi. We'll be taking the last question in the chat box, and it's from Baggy. She's saying, I really wonder what it is what is the real reason for big finance difference between mitigation and adaptation, according to general idea. Mitigation action can answer faster than adaptation actions, and that is really important for greenhouse gases. However, today, most of the countries need adaptation activities, and considering this is a global issue, why do we still have that much behind of adaptation goals? Did you get that? Xavi, I'm muted.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I think it's just about commercial viability. I think renewable energies have been there since 2010, right? So there's a bit of understanding about the different risks, etc. Like the risk related to those technologies are understood well. Some have been, kind of addressed, whether it's credit offtake or etc. other things. So I think it's more has to do with like better understanding the market and being not bold enough to venture into new technologies which have probably greater risk. And these are just not technology risks, right? Like when you go at working at different economy level or like country level, then they're like greater risk on, as I mentioned, like credit risk or different currency risk, etc. So I think it becomes a bit of a risky situation to invest in, and the investor is not comfortable, as Brigu and Kristen kind of said also. So it becomes very difficult. So I think it's more like understanding of technology. So that's why like a lot of transport investments that you see in EVs and other things, energy sector, renewable energy, it's pretty much solar water heater investments that we saw a big jump. So yeah, those are like are well understood technologies, but also again coming back to the point, right? Like if you have some successful demonstrations cases or instruments that you can showcase, I think that becomes really important to kind of scale those up. So it has to do with commercial viability of those sectors, and even in mitigation, if you see, like it's just energy and transport, like there's hardly much investment going to water sector or other sectors which are again relatively new technologies or maybe considered still as public goods. So I would say commercial viability. And I think second point I want to flag also here is also better data, right? There's better data as well. So there are data gaps in the global landscape as well. You don't see domestic budgets being tracked well because they're not tagged. There's lack of data on industrial decarbonization. I think that's a missing piece as well. I think public sector investments are better captured than private sector because again, there's no voluntary reporting. So I would say this has to be two aspects. One is actual trends and more commercial viability, but also our ability to track better data on those different sectors.
All right, thank you so much, Xavi, for your amazing session. Over to you, Jen. But before that, I'll be sending the attendance link to the chat box. So remember to sign your attendance.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Xavi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Xavi, for that knowledge and insights about the report and the work that CPI is doing. We're definitely gonna take note of your email for further questions if that's possible also. And yeah, that was a great introduction to what we're gonna discuss now in this second hour, where we have some amazing speakers that have been engaging in the negotiations on climate finance as negotiators, as observers, but closely following what is going on. So that's what's important right now, that we can share this insights and so on. So we're gonna start with I'm gonna give a really brief introduction to where we're standing so far, and then in the process, the convention, starting where the convention was signed in 1992. There was an obligation of provision of climate finance by developed countries or Annex 1 parties based on the basis of equity, and they should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects. This is Article 3.1 of the convention. And then developed parties should also shall, and this is important that we look at the language. When it's shall, it's mean that's an obligation that they have to provide new and additional financial resources to assist developing countries. And there's also a taking in account of need and of adequacy and predictability. and appropriate burden sharing among developed countries. And this is part of Article 4.3. Then it creates the financial mechanism as one of the main sources of distribution of finance under the convention. And as you might know, on COP15, there was the Copenhagen Accord, which was a non-legally binding but very important political commitment from developed countries to developing countries to provide from 30 billion per year up to 100 billion in total until 2020, and then 100 billion per year from 2020 to 2025. And this, of course, then leads to the negotiation that we're dealing right now with, which is the NCQG. But another context as well of articles in the Paris Agreement, we have the third objective of the Paris Agreement, which also take note of making flows consistent with pathways towards low carbon and climate resilient development. And you can see this exemplified in one of the papers from Charlene Watson, talking about how 2.1C can be embedded in government policies. And there's different options, and then countries decide in their financial strategies and plans on how they're going to align such financial flows to contribute to the huge needs of financing. But then going back to the Paris Agreement, if you look at Article 9, you see that again the world shall provide the finance, but now thematically on mitigation and adaptation, and other countries are invited to do voluntarily. And again, developed countries, sorry, this is a typo, developed countries should take the lead in mobilizing climate finance. And as such, mobilization should be present as a progression of previous efforts. So we're talking then feeds to being the floor of 100 billions on the NCQG, but of course we're expecting it to progress during the years. And last but not least, the very important balance between mitigation and adaptation that have been discussed so far in this call. That in starting COP24, now we are talking about the discussions on the NCQG, where it was decided to start these discussions in the technical expert dialogues, where they agreed to consider, and in Glasgow, then they initiate the work program. And the context so far is meeting the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement and the mandate, and decides that it will be taking into account needs and priorities of developing countries, including the elements, which is very important, that then we can drive the discussion around these, around quality, quantity, scope, access features, sources of funding, and transparency arrangements. So with that said, now we're looking at the negotiations at this COP, which you can see the updated input paper that, well, if you click on this, you will see what are the last options on the table for the different elements. As an addition, there's going to be hopefully a decision on what's going to be continuing on discussions on the Article 2.1C in regards of if we're going to have a work program that it will lead to a decision at COP30. So that being said, I want to invite here one of our friends that I met during the process, and it's a very nice that you're here. A very, I can say, a case, best case practice of how youth engaging from observers then become negotiators and lead processes in their delegations. I'm talking about Abdiel Gudlas. I'm going to give you the spotlight right now. So nice to have you here, Abdiel. It's great to see you here. And well, you can introduce yourself, how you engage in the process, and we want to know specifically what can you tell what can you tell our audience about the process so far, where we stand, where are the main tension points, and what's on stake for developing countries.
Hi everyone, and for me, and also thank you, Genaro, and also to Youngo, to the Climate Finance Unit, for inviting me to participate in this amazing event that we are in building capacity with different youths and from from many regions in the world. And as Gennaro mentioned, I am Abdiel Douglas from Panama. I am the negotiator of finance for Panama. And I have been working in the government in every related topic that is to align the financial flows of Panama to the Paris Agreement goals. I have been following the negotiations and also other topics. So I started following the climate finance negotiations since Sharm el Sheikh. That was at COP27. It has been like 2 years for me to be part of this ongoing process, and it has been, let's say, a little bit tough because you have to engage with in different documents and the language, how the process work, also the different agenda items that climate finance has as a whole. But I got the opportunity to start as a negotiator thanks to the Climate Youth Negotiator Program. Basically, the Climate Youth Negotiator Program is a program that trains and also empower youths to participate in the negotiations under the UNFCCC. So today I have the pleasure to present you and also share you some views of the main topic, not one of the main topic, but the main topic that is gonna be discussed and also agree. And on the next COP, this is gonna be the NCQG, or New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance. As Gennaro mentioned already, he provided some previous elements that are being discussed and also for parties to engage related to NCQG. As we all know, in 2019, developing countries agreed that by 2020, and they will have to mobilize $100 billion per goal to support $100 billion per year to support developing countries and under their climate actions commitment. And as we all know, and also as Gennaro mentioned, when countries signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, they decided to set a new collective quantified goal on climate finance that is going to replace the existing goal of $100 billion per year. And this NCQG has to be adopted at COP29 in Azerbaijan. And why the new collective quantified goal is important, and well, this goal is important because it will channel graded funds toward climate action in developing countries. Also, it will support the implementation of low carbon, climate resilient solution, energy, transport, agriculture, and other sectors. And also by increasing the financial support, because this is something that is being discussed, that the financial support that developed countries has to provide to developing countries, by increasing it, it will enable developing countries to step up their climate ambitions in their next round of national climate plans, in their next rounds of NDC that have to be presented on the next year. So where are we now right now? We already have a decision that was agreed on COP28 at Dubai that established that we have to, well, let me explain before. So how the NCQG was established, we have an ad hoc work program. Basically, this ad hoc work program that was established at COP in Glasgow is established for working programs for established for technical expert dialogue for parties to engage in different elements of the NCQG. So in the last 2 years, and the different parties that signed the Paris Agreement and also the convention has been working and engaging on different elements that has to be included in the NCQG, reviewing different lessons from the $100 billion goal, and also understanding what is the role of the public finance, what is the role of the private sector, etc. Many other elements that also was presented by the previous speaker. So seeing that when parties arrive to Dubai and see that we haven't reached many engagement on some of the elements, the CMA 5 and decided to transition in a mode of works that will in a way that will enable the development of a draft negotiation text and for the NCQG that is going to be taken into consideration for COP29. And also, it was decided that this year we're going to have 3 technical expert dialogue. And one of these expert technical expert dialogue was held in Cartagena, Colombia. The other one was held during the ESBIS, during the negotiation of climate change of mid-year. And also the next and the last one was held in Baku, Azerbaijan, that, well, basically was on last week. So on this process, and the parties were having discussions back to back on the different elements, and also on the language that we will like to see under the NCQG. So no, the question is, where are we now? So the technical expert dialogue that was set up in Baku, Azerbaijan, provided a space for parties to engage in an open and also inclusive and party-driven and process. The co-chairs, they provide an input paper for parties to review previous disbanded event by the UNFCCC, and also this the structure of this paper, and had two annex. One annex and present the different views and also collect the submissions that parties and groups have of their vision of the process, and also the Annex 2 presented a summary overview of the different package of element that the NCQG, that the new collective quantified goal on climate finance could have. So where are we now? So basically, we were discussing some element as preamble, context, the quantum, the qualitative elements. We are discussing the transparency arrangement, revisions, and others. So at the moment, as we know, well, climate finance is a bit, well, this agenda item as a whole is a very political agenda item, because it invites different elements of the of parties and others. So let's start with the first element. I'm gonna give you my view of what was discussed on all of the elements. So the first element that we have was the preamble. Many parties were discussing if the NCQG has to be established under COP, under the COP, and also on the CMA. Well, on the COP, on the Conference of the Party, or also on the CMA, that was the Conference of the Parties under the Paris Agreement. And also other parties were just discussing that the NCQG has to be decided and under the CMA, and also has some language of COP21, but specifically on the paragraph 53 that set up this new collective quantified goal on climate finance. There were different views, because for some parties, if we establish a new collective quantified goal on climate finance under the CMA, this wouldn't include as in some of the elements that Gennaro mentioned before, as the CBDR, or also the principles of provisions that developed countries has to provide to developing countries for them to fulfill their actions or their commitments under the Paris Agreement. There were discussion regarding to the preamble on those elements. Also on the context, there were discussions about that the NCQG has to reflect the lesson learned and about the $100 billion goal. Many developed parties were saying that the NCQG has to reflect that the $100 billion goal has been achieved. Also, we don't have like a report that says that the $100 billion goal has been adopted. That was some of the perspective of the developing countries, but some developed countries and try to have this reference on the context. Also, there were discussion, because on the previous input paper we have a reference of the principles that the NCQG has to include. For example, the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, has to be gender responsive, has to have indigenous responsive, and ambition responsive, different and social elements. But this and the principal elements was not included as a section in this new input paper that the co-chairs provide us. It was just included as a paragraph inside of the context. So some parties were discussing that we have to have an inclusion of principle as a whole section, and not just as a paragraph of the context. Also, many parties were discussing if the new collective quantified goals should be on the context of all the main goals of the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, and the ones that, well, Gennaro already mentioned us, 2.1a, 2.1b, and also, well, and as a whole, Article 2, but other parties were just providing that the NCQG has to be set up and also has to recognize Article 2.1c that and provide us language that that all parties has to align their financial flows. And also some parties were, well, engaging if the NCQG has to be set up in accordance of Article 9.3 that established that developed countries has to lead as a part of a global effort. Developed parties has to lead the mobilization of climate finance, but also other parties were discussing if the NCQG has to be set up and under all Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, because under all Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, there is a mandate not just for mobilization of climate finance, but also there is a mandate for provision of climate finance. And what is provision and what is mobilization? So basically, provision refers to the transfer of international public funds from developed countries to developing countries, and also mobilization refers to the governments, to develop countries to shift private climate finance toward climate action in developing countries. So also developed countries, when some developing countries want to try to see some reference, not just on the mobilization, but also for the on the provision of climate finance, because this was an important topic and it wasn't reflect on the previous goal. And also some developed countries, some parties were trying to include some reference that the NCQG is not just a goal that it has to be reflect on the flows that we have inside of the UNFCCC, but also we have to reflect the international financial architecture that we already have. For example, this goal has to be an investment and also domestic and climate finance goal, and not just the funds that we have inside of the UNFCCC. So these were like and also I forget this one. This is one of the most important, I think so. And if we are gonna include in the context, and also the context has to recognize that developing countries has been increasing their ambitions and under the NDC, but they have not received the climate finance to implement these commitments. And also we are going to include any recognition of loss and damage into the context. So these were one of the elements that were discussed. And for the context, and also, well, the next one is very political, is the quantum. Because on the previous goal, it was set up that it was $100 billion per year. But for this new collective quantified goal on climate finance, party has not engaged on which is going to be the quantum of all of these goals. Some of the parties, some subgroup, and we're reflecting that this new collective quantified goal on climate finance has to be decided in trillions of dollars. But some other parties and were making intervention that if we want to have trillions for the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, we have to increase the base of the contributors. And as we all know, on the previous climate finance goal, we already have like the Annex 1 parties, Annex 2 parties. We already have and set up who has to be a provider of climate finance and who has to be, let's say, like a recipient of climate finance. But for some parties, on some parties, when the $100 billion goal was established, there were like different capabilities of some countries. Some countries didn't have like the emission that they have today, but these capabilities, and also there have been an increase of emissions in some developing countries. They have to shift to be a contributor for the new goal, and also increase the quantum that some developing countries are expecting. So some parties were making intervention that there is no legal mandate to discuss contributors and to be part of the goal. and also that the contributors are already agree in Article 9 of the Paris Agreement and also under the UNFCCC. So these were like some of the discussions regarding to the contributors, and also there were discussions in the quantum if we're gonna include in any reflection of Article 2.1c. As we know, Article 2.1c seeks to align all of the financial flows, public, private, philanthropy, different sources of climate finance that many parties have. But there were discussion if we are going to include the domestic financial flows of some parties, or we are going to just take into account the public and financial flows that developed countries has. Many parties were discussing that Article 2.1c, this article of alignment of financial flows, it already has a space on the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue, as Gennaro was mentioned, and we have to include all of the reference of Article 2.1c into the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue, and not included under the NCQG. Understanding that NCQG, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, is a goal for developing countries and not a goal that include developing countries. So there were some discussion regarding to Article 2.1c. I think this is going to be one of the political elements. And also many developing countries were making intervention regarding to this, as we already see on the previous films, that there is enough finance for other activities such as war. We see that there is a lot of finance for COVID-19. So where is the political will for finance for climate action? That so yeah, many developing countries are saying that we could, the same way that we are raising finance for war, we could raise finance for climate actions. And also there were in discussion on the quantum if we are going to include the private sector, where some parties were discussing that we already have history with the private sector, as we all know. Private sector, the different instruments that the private sector use, they give more depth to developing countries. So many developing countries were saying that the climate and this new collective quantified goal on climate finance has to be just established has to be set up by the financial flows of developed countries, the public financial flows, and not include no reference to private sector, because many of the developing countries doesn't have the financial sector to attract climate finance that are being given from private sector. So there were some discussions in regarding to that. Also, we have some elements such as the qualitative elements. This was another big and important topic. Regarding to the qualitative element, many developed and we were discussing about access. So many developing countries were saying that we should enhance access and for public and international climate finance, understanding that many countries doesn't have the capabilities, the national capabilities, to engage with the mechanism and with the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, for example, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and also the Global Environmental Facility. And some of these funds has many procedures, so we have to try to find a way to simplify the procedures of the UNFCCC and funds. Also, there were discussions about inclusion of these enablers of climate finance, understanding that, for example, how the NCQG is gonna attack what is high cost of capital in countries that has high debt, and how we're gonna create more physical space for developing countries, which kind of and in this, and we were discussing about the different instruments that we could account under the NCQG, for example, grants, and has to be accounted just for adaptation and also for loss and damage and for mitigation. And we were discussing that just high concessional finance, for example, which region, for example, I am from Latin America, and for Latin America it works more, the warranties work more for Latin America. For the other regions, maybe debt swaps. So we were discussing like how we can include instruments into the NCQG that are not gonna increase the high cost of capital and also increase the debt that some countries are having. Also, we were discussing about how we are gonna engage with reference of the private sector, if we're gonna include reference to the private sector into the context, into the quantum, into the qualitative elements, or it could be on the text, or it could be in a way that we did on the GST, for example, in the global and El Subtate that was adopted at COP28. We have a section of other actors, so we could include a call to action to the private sector. And so we could work on that, but the private sector could be an additionality to the NCQG, but not part of the accounting of the different elements as a whole. Sorry, Genaro, I saw that you have your hands up. My bad.
No worries. I want to thank you so much for the very broad and comprehensive perspectives on how we move so far in the different elements. I know it might be a lot for everyone, but no worries that we're going to continue discussing these things as the Academy move on. And also, I want to now introduce this section, which is going to be a more dynamic discussion between our panelists. So I first want to introduce Nicole Makowski, who holds a bachelor degree in international relations and is pursuing a master's in integration and international cooperation of the National University of Rosario. She also has postgraduate studies in climate change and sustainable cities and coordinates international affairs of the National Director of Climate Change in Argentina until this year. And she have represented the country as a negotiator for the UNFCCC, the G20 and IPCC, among others. Has experience in local climate planning as a university professor, but now also serves as a climate diplomacy coordinator for the Climate Finance Group of Latin America and the Caribbean, GFLAC. So thank you so much, Nicole, for being here with us. I also want to introduce Romy. You might know her. She's one of our champions in Youngo, former contact point for the Finance and Markets Working Group. You have been super engaged both at the policy and as an observer of the climate finance negotiations, both at your role as a German watch, as a follow or work study, you might call it, writing reports and so on Article 2.1c, but also on the NCQG. And you have done invaluable, like you can't quantify that how much support this girl has been giving to the youth around the world. And now currently she's serving as a global focal point for Youngo. So Romy and Nicole, thank you so much for being here. I think I will start now with a really brief question to Nicole, since she was she's working on GFLAC, who has done a lot of work on reporting on also sustainable finance. And Abdiel mentioned on the role of the private sector, which is still very shady. There's no clear like understanding how it could fit. But maybe you have some perspectives on how it would be possible to include sustainable finance in the NCQG as a context or whatever you think. And I also want to know, well, then I will do a second question and for both of you. So maybe, Nicole, if you have some insights on this topic, it would be great.
Sure. Gracias, Genaro. Thank you for the invitation. So I was hearing what Abdiel was saying about the private sector. I followed the last technical expert dialogue online last week. And, you know, most developing countries want to have some kind of reference to, you know, the importance of multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, even credit rating agencies, not only to scale up their climate financing, but also, you know, to adjust both their portfolios and their operations, you know, lending concessional resources to developing countries, especially for adaptation, mainly in the form of grants. But the issue here is, and we can talk a lot about what, you know, parties want, but at the end of the day, you know, we're talking about an intergovernmental body. So the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, is between governments. It's not between, you know, private sector actors. So there's so much you can actually ask of them. That's why if you go over the decisions, you might find that most of the time parties encourage these institutions or the private sector, or highlight, for example, the importance of the need of the international, financial architecture reform, which has, appeared before in the global stock take decision. So these calls to action, as Abdiel was saying, they are calls. You cannot, oblige other actors that are not states, that are not nations. And I think regarding this issue of the private sector, we see the synergies with the dialogues under the 2.1c article, which is the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogues. So in October, we will have the second one of this year. And one of the topics of that dialogue will be, all the actors of the financial or of the international financial ecosystem. So there's some interlinkages there. I don't know, how strong the language will be on this issue in the NCQG decision. Something, at least in my opinion, will most definitely appear. It has to, but there will be no obligations in that regard. And I think it's also very important to bear in mind that, the financial discussions in the UNFCCC also have impacts and are being impacted by other financial discussions in other fora. So, for example, this year we have COP16 on biodiversity, so finance will be a topic there. And they will be discussing also the MBSAPs, which are kind of our NDCs in the climate change regime. But also you have the annual meetings of the IMF, of the World Bank. There will be a very important conference in 2025. We'll follow up on several documents, including the Addis Ababa Agenda on Sustainable Development Finance. So all these discussions, and I'm sure I'm missing a lot of other important fora, are interlinked and have impacts. How these impacts are then translated into text is the issue. So I will leave it here, and I don't know if Romy surely has something useful to add to that.
Yeah, Romy, if you want to add to this discussion, and what do you think it might be like the focus should be like the focus of the NCQG? I don't want to bias your question or response, but I want to hear your thoughts on this issue as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nicole, for this great overview. I would like to react on something you said regarding the interlinkage of international financial architecture reforms and the new collective quantified goal, maybe to contribute to this conversation. So it also matters on the structure of the goal. So to what extent, for example, reforms of international financial institutions affect the quantum of the goal, depending on you include a broader investment layer, for example. And I totally agree with you, Nicole. We have right now a lot of financial discussions evolving, especially over the past 2 years. And there is definitely a problem that we have conflicting mandates in this discussion. I agree that, of course, the UNFCCC cannot apply rules to, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions. But however, we see that they can send very strong impulses. So, for example, if you look at the Paris alignment methodologies of MDBs, that was definitely something came from the UNFCCC and applied and led to a change within other actors of the international financial architecture. So right now I see a lot of interlinkages between IFA reforms and the new collective quantified goal discussions, also on innovative sources when we're talking about the G20 initiative on taxing the super rich, or talking about the UN Framework Convention on Tax, the tax task force of Barbados, Kenya, and France. So there are a lot of things that right now come together, and I think that makes the NCQG discussions also extremely hard because it's so many things you have to look at, and maybe to also add on what you said, Abdil, I think you gave a great overview of the discussions over the past years. So I think the main problem right now in the NCQG discussion is that the NCQG cannot be everything all at once for everybody. And so there's a big disagreement on what the NCQG should be. So should it be climate debt? So the developed countries are the majorly responsible for the climate crisis. So many developing countries see the NCQG as part of paying the climate debt. Is it just like a support mechanism, or is it a means to an end? So should we cover all the financial needs that are out there, or is it more like a collective goal, including domestic finance, a broader investment goal? So there's just a lot of disagreement, and not that many things are agreed at that point of stage, like 2 months before COP. So it's gonna be very, very difficult in Baku to find a good outcome.
That's really great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Abdil, if you also want to comment on this, you can raise your hand at any point. But I wanted to come back to Nicole and Romit for a question more on what are from the groups that you're engaging with, both being civil society or the academia or being negotiated part of delegations. What do you think are the priorities for the NCQG? How does this consider or could consider climate justice? So Nicole, then Romy, and Abdil. If you want to add anything that you think it's important as well to the mix, feel free.
Sure. Okay, so I think that for many developing countries as well as civil society organizations, the qualitative elements are really, really important. There's this sense that we have to, have an NCQG that is significantly different from the 100 billion goal, in the sense that we have a different context. So as you were mentioning, Genaro, the 100 billion goal was decided, back in 2009, and it was a political agreement without any kind of, technical work that could back up the number, the quantum, the $100 billion goal. So I think, many countries as well as SCOs want to make this right by including these qualitative elements. So you mentioned some of them. I think the issues of access, or at least, the issues related to access will be one of the main important ones. And this also relates to what I was saying regarding the private sector, because I think there could be, a call to the funds of the financial mechanism. So we have the adaptation fund, we have the GEF, the GCF, but we also have the loss and damage fund now. And I think there could be, a call to those funds to improve their access modalities, especially for local communities and indigenous peoples, as well as women and other vulnerable groups. So I think this is a common demand I have seen. But I think we don't have to forget that the quantum will also be important. So because we have these two kind of speeches, let's say now, because sometimes people want to put, for example, many developed countries have been focusing actually on the qualitative elements because they don't want to discuss the quantum, the number. They are saying that is a political decision, and it will be a political decision at the end of the day. But developing countries have been doing a lot of work, in order to put on the table proposals, concrete proposals, as the previous colleagues were mentioning. So I think we have to take what is said on the negotiating table, just try to take that as what it is, which is a negotiation. Because sometimes, for example, I will give you an example to be more concrete. But in the last TED, the United States, which is, in a election process, mentioned that they were okay with the qualitative elements, with all of them, basically, that they didn't see anything wrong. So how is that when 3 months ago we heard the complete opposite? So you have to, read these subtleties, which sometimes is very difficult if you're not within the process. But yeah, we'll leave it here.
Yeah, I think it's you touched a point there, which is the negotiation that also begs the question of what are the trade-offs from the different priorities of developing countries. But I want to go back to Romy and ask as well, what do you think are the priorities? And maybe if you want to also add regarding this topic, what are the main tensions that you see and where could be those trade-offs?
Oh, very broad question. I think you could answer this question better than I, being the current contact point for finance of Youngo, but I try to do my best.
Oh, Romy, I don't think we cannot hear you anymore, or is it me?
Hello?
Can someone? Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, great. Apologies. When did I cut off at the beginning? Just start from scratch. One of the main priorities of the civil society, the human rights-based constituencies, is to set the narrative right. So the human rights-based constituency, which also includes Youngo, think that the Global North owes the Global South a climate debt. So there is a big campaign ongoing. Also this week, we have a big Global Week of Action that demands for 1 trillion in grants equivalent finance for the NCQG, and seeing that 1 trillion as part of a bigger climate debt, 5 trillion. So setting the narrative right will be a focus of the rights-based constituencies. Beside that, and I can just agree with Nicole, so qualitative elements are key. Maybe to also answer a question in the chat in more detail. So we achieved, like in 2022, the 100 billion goal was achieved for the first time. But if you look on additionality of these funds, or also on the grants equivalents of these funds, the ratio is really low. So, for example, CARE International said that just 7% are new and additional to regular development assistance, and just up to 35 billion were grant equivalent finance according to the Oxford methodology. So setting the qualitative elements right is very important. Civil society is pushing for years already to get a climate finance definition to prevent, for example, that climate finance that loans to market rate conditions are defined as climate finance, for example. And as Youngo, we also are always advocating for operationalizing human rights and gender responsiveness, indigenous rights, child and youth responsiveness in these goals. Another key priority of Youngo and other civil society constituencies is to have thematic sub-goals, so to include loss and damage and to prevent that adaptation finance falls short again, addressing disenablers, as Nicole already mentioned, is also a priority. And I think also touching upon your second question, Jen, on what are the big fights and tension points. So one of the big tension points is definitely the contributor base. And so I think we as civil society have to prevent that we somehow fall into the trap to get like a voluntary goal as the contributions to the loss and damage fund, for example, because there are some countries have very problematic language on this regard. Also, in my personal opinion, we have to fight against including domestic finance, etc., in a multi-layered approach. So there are a lot of tension points and a lot of things to do. And unfortunately, it's already very late in time. So there are the most country groups already have their positions fixed. There are just some room left to engage on a political level, including the UNGA in New York, IMF, World Bank meetings, and then COP for sure. So I think it will be a very difficult task to get together good NCQG. I give it to you, Abdi.
Abdul, do you want to add something on the tensions?
Well, definitely. Sorry, my bad. Sorry, I agree with Nicole and Romy, and for the inclusion of climate justice. I think that on the context we have to make a recognitions, and by the end of the day, it's the most vulnerable countries and also communities that are on the front line of climate change. So we have to include in the NCQG recognitions that these develop and that these most and vulnerable communities are getting impacted by climate change, and also we have to have a recognition on that. Also, I agree that we should keep as a standalone the principal section, so we could see the NCQG as a gender responsiveness, youth and responsiveness, children, and also and other elements of the civil society not included into the context as a paragraph. Also, as Nicole mentioned, I was thinking about qualitative elements. They are very important and also are key to see how we can enhance access for communities, how we can simplify access for those communities that are in the front line of climate and of climate change. And also, well, definitely agree that grants are key for adaptation and also loss and damage, and see how we are going to include loss and damage as a whole, because this is very political, and also it's one of the big topics right now. Some countries are just seeing adaptation mitigation, some adaptation mitigation and loss and damage, so how we are going to include that. And also, in another element, I think it's very important to have a recognition of enablers of climate action as a whole. Don't forget about technology, capacity building, just transitions are elements that we have to include in a reference into the NCQG. So there are going to be a lot of key discussions on the following weeks. As Romy mentioned, we have UNCTAD. We're going to have the high-level dialogue of ministers that is going to be before COP, and it's going to be the 8th and 9th of October. So we have to be looking at these discussions. There's going to be the pre-COP and, COP as a whole. So I forgot about this one, the G20 meeting that is going to be held in Brazil. We're going to have the biggest 20 economies of the world. So the results and also that are going to be happening there are going to be different political elements that are going to set up in some of the red lines for the NCQG. But let's see how this process are going on, because something that we at the technical level and was set up on the last day of Baku, where we're like, okay, so we take some of the technical elements we already have not agreed, but we could reach some agreement before COP. But there are some political elements that are above as technical, so we will have to leave it on the political side. And what we as technical of each developing countries has to do is to try to engage more the political side, and to provide them all of the inputs and for what is going to happen in November. So yeah.
That's a great insight. Thank you, Abdiel. Yeah, you touched the point on the fact that a lot of things has been discussed already, and we have a very nice, comprehensive options on the table. But at the end of the day, what will be decided is mostly going to be political. So we're going to see ministers and people that actually have power making those decisions. Maybe could be like even the last day of COP or not. But definitely all eyes will be in Baku in October for the high-level ministerial dialogue. And we have a question regarding this issue in the chat. Mukta, I don't know if you want to open your mic and camera to make this question, or should I just read it out?
Hi, Jen, and thanks to this wonderful panelist on shedding light. Especially thanks to Nicole, because I was really unaware of the $100 billion fund which was committed. Yeah, and regarding to those on same lines, right? Is there anything which is currently operational, or do you envision in the coming COP at the high level ministerial meeting, some things on similar lines would be proposed? And on the same lines, right, people here, such as myself, who sometimes work with governments and politicians, what can we do? And even on a subnational level, what can we do to influence and ensure the ambition is raised as well? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. For anyone that wants to answer, please go ahead. What can we do at a national level to push for this?
Yeah, I just wanted, well, thank you, Mukta, for your question. Just wanted to clarify that the 100 billion is not a fund. It's the predecessor of this new goal that will be adopted at COP29. So what was established back in 2009 was that developed countries had to collectively mobilize $100 billion per year until 2020, and this was later on extended until 2025. So this 100 billion is the predecessor of this new goal. I don't think there's any other quantified commitment. I think that's what you were referring. Then within each of the different funds of the convention, for example, different regions such as, well, Africa, but then you also have SEEDs, which are small island developing states, and LDCs, the least developed countries. For example, in the Green Climate Fund, in the GCF, they have a certain allocation for them, certain oh, sorry, I'm mixing my Spanish and my Portuguese because I'm now in Brazil, so it's kind of messy at this point of the day. Yeah, and what to put political pressure, and having worked on the government before, I think you should contact. So by contact, I mean look up for the negotiators' emails, your politicians' emails, their hashtags, their LinkedIns, whatever. Write to them, ask them what are their positions for COP29. What will they'll say regarding this new climate finance goal? And if you don't see that they are, actually sharing that information, because I know it's difficult in some countries, you can, being as part as Yungo, you can have this type of meetings just to talk about different issues. You can meet in person. So you can take, different actions. I think Romy was mentioning the campaign that will happen now before Yunga. Other organizations are also, having different campaigns. For example, JEFELAC is doing one particularly directed at negotiators. But we are using the hashtag no goal, no world. So I will put it down here in the chat so you can, follow that. But just, reach out to the people who are involved. And also in the UNFCCC, you can search, the focal points. If you don't know the names of the people responsible for climate finance, you can write to them and they should answer you, hopefully, eventually. Yeah.
That's really great. Romy?
Yes, thank you. I can add on that a bit, more of a global North perspective as like advocating those countries who have to pay. So it is always important to have also the national cycle in mind. So, for example, for Germany, where I'm from, there is right now the negotiations happening on the national budget for next year. So it's always good to advocate for a higher amount of public finance at the national level for global north countries. Also, there's possibilities to influence the election cycle in the midterm for not just a higher climate finance under the NCQG, but also for policy action on the international financial architecture reform side of things. I'm not sure. I wanted to look it up, but I was too slow. Jen, is the next march, the global march on the Pay Up campaign on the 21st? I think it is. So
Yeah,
public
align with the
pressure.
Fridays for Future and so on.
Great. So this Friday, guys, public pressure on the streets, campaigning, everything what Nicole said. Reach out to them. Be really annoying. It doesn't help. Just be brave and join us all on Friday.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think what Romy said was very important. And if you're calling us from a developed country, it's a lot more bureaucratic and I'd say tight what the positions are. And as much as you can convince negotiators from Switzerland or any developed country, for example, what really dictates what's going to be the margins of the positions is going to be at the parliament level. So there's no like push, and these countries also have very good laws where you can go and speak to your parliament and so on. If there's no push from that side, then it's gonna be difficult for a COP at a very late state to make changes on those decisions. So join those marches, join those discussions, and let's try to put as much pressure as we can to have redirect pathways and flows towards a livable planet. So yeah, I want to know if there's any other questions from our audience. And Carolina, Caro, do you wanna open your mic to make a question? No? We can also just what do you mean by setting the narrative, Romy, on when you said that? I think it would be interesting for people to know.
Yeah, I can clarify that. So with setting the narrative right, I mean that there are divergent views on what this NCQG should be, and civil society constituency want that this quantum of the NCQG, the climate finance of the NCQG, is seen as a small part of a larger climate debt the global north owes the global south, because the wealth of the global north was built on colonial exploitation of fossil fuel exploitation. So in this narrative, the NCQG is a goal which provides and mobilizes money from the global north to the global south only. And there are quite some views that just say, yeah, we can exclude domestic finance, we can just exclude a larger investment goal, including philanthropies, etc. And that would be against the narrative, or like how I see it, the climate justice perspective, what this goal should be. It's one piece of the puzzle, and it doesn't say that we don't need also other policies on domestic level, like everything Xavi was talking about in a presentation before. But it's just, this is the piece of the NCQG should fulfill is a justice piece, and not blur all responsibilities. And yeah, I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, I think that one, complementing what Romy said, I think that we should look at the NCQG as a very defined mandate on what it should be, on what has not been done from developed countries to developing countries. But never forget that it all sits on a context. It all sits on a broad systemic issue and of colonization and how our global financial systems and monetary systems doesn't work on our favor to align financial flows to the climate goals and so on. And that's why strong political messages are important at this phase as we continue after the decision on the NCQG to keep discussing on broad the international financial architecture reforms. There's going to be the conference of financing for development in April of next year in Barcelona, and then we are going to have some sort of decision, hopefully on Article 2.1c and COP 30 in Berlin. At the same time as we're taking decisions on how systemically NDCs are going to be, working on and so on. What standards and so on. So there's a lot of things to keep on the eye, but also not distract ourselves with what's important is that developing countries are not receiving the support that they need to take action. And at the end of the day, that action benefits everyone in the world. So it's a matter of working together internationally and cooperating to reach the goals. Okay, I want to know if there's any last messages that Romeo Abdiel want to say. Nicole unfortunately had to leave because she had a problem with the internet that cut down in her hotel, but she sends her regards and she was very happy to be part of this space. So applause for Nicole if she was here maybe in the recording, and applause for Romy and Abdiel for being part of this session, and Chavi as well, that I know she's still, no, maybe not, but anyways, it was really nice to have that context on the global financial flows. So thank you very much, everyone. We're gonna see each other on the next sessions. Next session is going to be on adaptation finance, that we discuss a lot why we were not meeting, but we're gonna go deep even more. So see you and best of luck for everything else that you're doing in life. Any last words that you want to say, Romy? Okay. No? Okay.
Thanks to you and Eshoya as well. Great job, guys. Great job.
Thank you for
All
joining
right,
us.
bye-bye.
Thank you all. Have a nice day and keep the good job, guys.
Yo.